The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Anisha Singh of the Center for American Progress reviews the disturbing record of Donald Trump's newest Supreme Court nominee. The Nation's John Nichols explains the impact of the Supreme Court's decision on voter purging. Plus, Bill Press with Congressman Dan Kildee on his reaction to President Trump's press conference with Vladimir Putin. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Anisha Singh works to engage young activists and leaders in the political process. She says Brett Kavanaugh is an alarming choice for the Supreme Court who could have an impact on their lives for decades to come. And we say hello to Anisha Singh, Senior Organizing Director at Generation Progress, which is the youth engagement arm of the Center for American Progress. Anisha Singh, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. What are your biggest concerns about Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh?
I think going right in, we knew when Trump was campaigning that he was saying he has a litmus test. He's going to make sure whoever he gets to nominate on the Supreme Court going forward, he would make sure that they were going to overturn Roe, that they were going to dismantle healthcare as we know it. And we've seen the kinds of policies, executive orders and such that he has put forward throughout his administration. So we know that he is sticking to a lot of the things that he said on the campaign trail. And this is no different. He nominated Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, who has now been sitting on the court one full term. And we've been able to see some of the ways that Gorsuch has been deciding cases which have been detrimental and harmful to our society. And so we know we're going to expect the same thing here. But then when you look at Kavanaugh's specific record as well, you're seeing the same thing, right? We know that there was a minor, a young woman who was in government custody, and she was stopped from her right to an abortion. We've seen that Kavanaugh has agreed with the dissent regarding health care. And most worrying to me, especially given everything that we're finding out about Russia, the investigation, and the Trump-Putin summit, is that he is someone who has said that the president has absolute discretion to hire or fire a special counsel, that a president should never be criminally indicted. And that's really worrisome because we know Trump cares about loyalty, and he is thinking about this investigation and wants to make sure there's someone in the court who has his back if and when that question comes to the court. So those are some of the high-level issues we have with Kavanaugh, and we have thousands of documents yet to come in from Kavanaugh's time in the Bush administration and other periods in his life. And as things keep coming in, we're learning more and more about his harmful record for workers, for gun violence prevention, name an issue, and it's a pretty disturbing paper trail.
Now, one of the highest profile issues that we are hearing about, and you alluded to it, it's about a woman's right to choose. How real are the concerns that Roe v. Wade could be at risk?
It's a real concern. And the thing is that there are different states right now, and you'll see some headlines from different newspapers and press outlets that, one that I read the other day was Texas is going to test abortion case with new Supreme Court once justice is confirmed, right? A lot of these states know it. There are a lot of cases that would really dismantle abortion rights as we know it, that are currently in the lower courts, district and circuit courts, or approaching those courts, that will end up being a question before the Supreme Court. And so we know that, if you're rich and you're privileged, abortion might still be accessible to you. But what ends up happening with a lot of these cases is if they go up and if they are decided against women, it's going to be more and more difficult for women to have that access to abortion. We know people of color, Black women especially, will have an even harder time to be able to have that access. We know the risks for health for women that will take place. And so there's that, but then there's also the Affordable Care Act aspect, because if that's also up, and it could come up again, because Congress has not had any luck in dismantling that, it might end up in the courts next. If that comes up too, then how does a woman get her access to health care if she, just by being a woman, is a pre-existing condition, right? So that's another issue. And so there's a lot at stake here for women, for family planning, for health care. And again, I just always like to emphasize this. This is a lifetime appointment. So whether this issue comes up once, twice, 3 times, it's the next 40 years that could be impacted that this individual will be on the court. And that's important too. You can't change that once he's on the court. It's a lifetime position.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court has, in fact, already upheld President Trump's travel ban that affects people from Muslim-majority countries. Are you concerned about other cases that could make an impact on civil rights and civil liberties on our country?
Absolutely. We've been watching lower court judges kind of saving us a lot of the time. When it was the Muslim ban that reached the lower court, the executive order was blocked. Transgender ban, we also saw the lower courts helped. And now we're seeing it with separation of families. And that's one that I'm really concerned about. We're seeing our lower courts are stopping this president's terrible, zero tolerance policy of separating families and is requiring him to reunite those families. But what if issues like this end up going all the way up to the Supreme Court? If we have such a conservative, extremist Trump court on the highest level, what does that mean for those families? What does that mean for our immigration policy? And then there's voting rights, which is huge. We have a 2020 election coming up, which we can all recognize is going to be so important. And we have had this year 2 gerrymandering cases that came before the Supreme Court, both of which the court basically punted for another time. There wasn't a real line or decision that was given to really explain what the do's and don'ts are for gerrymandering. And so we know that issue is going to come back up in the next couple of years before the 2020 election. How is that going to turn out? We know it's not going to be in favor of the Democrats if the court is just so conservative again, and it's, Trump's court. And so that's going to impact voting rights. It's going to impact how our votes count and how they're divvied up. And then other voting rights issues. We've already seen the Voting Rights Act be gutted once before several years ago. The fear is that can continue to happen. And that, again, impacts people of color the most, disenfranchised communities the most, individuals who might not be able to access the poll as easily as others. And so we have to worry about all these issues, and every single issue we care about ends up in the courts. And it's going to impact young people the most, because we're the ones that are going to have to deal with this administration, effect in the courts for decades to come.
We're speaking with Anisha Singh. She's a senior organizing director at Generation Progress, the youth engagement arm of the Center for American Progress. Anisha, Mr. Kavanaugh is seen by many as a pro-business candidate. If true, how might that play out if his nomination is successful?
Yeah, that's right. He's a DC insider through and through. He's been here his whole life. He's gone to Georgetown Prep. He's gone to Yale. He's been friends with every single corporation. We saw a letter come out from Yale alumni that are, the owners of different sports teams and different businesses, saying that Kavanaugh's a great guy. We're not seeing that when it comes to, your average worker. We're not seeing that his friend circles are the average American. And that's worrisome, because if he's not mingling with those people, if he doesn't know what the average American needs and wants, how is he going to have the ideology and the mindset to really represent us on the court? And it is a representation. It is important on our judiciary to have someone who is not just diverse by race or ethnicity or gender, but also by background. And he doesn't have any of that. He's kind of fit that profile for what the corporations really want to see on the court. And he's going to have their agenda and not the workers. And we've seen that with several of his cases throughout the years as well, where he has taken the side of different corporations as opposed to making sure that we have clean air, clean water. He has taken the side of corporation as opposed to different workers, doesn't really care for unions. And so that's definitely going to be a concern going forward. And I think everyone should be paying attention to his record on workers' rights as well.
Now, you touched on this next one a little bit with the opening question, but there is, of course, that great deal of debate on how Kavanaugh may approach executive power, especially in the context of the Mueller investigation. What are your views on that?
Yeah, that is very terrifying. This is an individual who is outright, I mean, Trump had a list of 25 individuals that he said he was choosing this nominee from. And of all of those nominees, Kavanaugh was the one who has outright come out and said the president has absolute discretion to do what he wants with the special counsel. He should never be criminally indicted. This is someone who said that he's going to put a nail in it and make sure that, you know, these are not things that a president has to worry about. In previous speakings, I think it was 2016, he had said that. So very recently. And so this is someone that Trump intentionally chose, and that was the one unique thing that Kavanaugh had. And so we know what the intentions are here, and if we want there to be a balance of power in our government, as our founding fathers intended, the judiciary cannot be the president in times like this, where we have this unprecedented investigation, unprecedented revelations coming out of this investigation, unprecedented loyalty of this president to another country, and signs of treason. And so we cannot have a nominee going anywhere through the Senate while this investigation is going on. We need to make sure that Kavanaugh is outright saying he would recuse himself from anything that might come forward to his court if he's on the Supreme Court that deals with this investigation and Trump's play and role in it. And until and unless we see both of those things happening, everybody should be really concerned about having someone like Kavanaugh being nominated and then put through to the court and kind of taking away that balance of power that we should be having, especially at this time.
Mm-hmm. Now, in accepting his nomination, Mr. Kavanaugh said, "A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law." How do you interpret that statement?
I think that's a statement that every nominee says when they're coming forward. It's an easy way to not answer questions about how you actually think about different issues and different laws and how to interpret them. It's easy to say, I'll follow precedent and I'll just have to look at what the law is and just interpret it exactly. When our Bill of Rights and our Constitution was created, it was created and it was written so that it was vague and broad, so that it could be interpreted based on what is currently happening. If you do a Control F on our Constitution, you don't see abortion written in there, but does that mean that means that it'll never be a thing? There are plenty of issues that'll never be a thing that you'll see in the Constitution, but we have interpreted the law to know that as we go on in times, we have to adjust accordingly. And it's dangerous when a nominee is not willing to say how they would properly interpret that law without actually giving any examples, especially right now, given everything that is happening, given the litmus test that Trump has said that he would have the nominee have, given Kavanaugh's record, we need him to be able to say, listen, I am not going to overturn Roe. I believe in a woman's right to her own body and autonomy. And that is important right now for him to be saying, and that's something that he is dodging and avoiding. And whenever he does end up in front of the Judiciary Committee for a hearing, if he does, that is a question that he has to answer. And polling is showing that the majority of Americans, whether Republican or Democrat, want him to answer that question because the majority of them do not want to see Roe overturned and are genuinely concerned about that issue.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, is not the only way Donald Trump is making a mark on our judicial system. He has been transforming the lower courts as well. How concerned should we be about the overall independence of the judicial system?
I love this question because that is so important. People, we know that like 100 cases at the most, probably more like 70, end up at the Supreme Court. But it's tens of thousands of cases that go through our district and circuit courts. And that's really, really important. Like I said earlier, the lower courts are the ones who have been stopping some of these terrible policies, family separation being one of the most recent. And so it's important for us to be paying attention to the judges that are being put, because what happened was while Obama was president, especially his last 2 years in term, the Republicans had control of the Senate, and they stopped all of President Obama's nominees to the lower courts, especially the circuit courts. So there was a lot of obstruction happening. And as a result, there were over 100 vacancies on the lower courts. That's a lot, 100 vacancies on the lower courts that Trump kind of fell into. And that's exactly what the Republicans were playing at. And now they've been racking them out. And in Trump's first year in office, I think it was either 14 or 17 circuit court nominees that were confirmed, which is a record since that's the most that has been confirmed since Reagan was president. And so they are putting on these extremist nominees, and some of them are terrible. They are individuals who have said things like affirmative action is the same thing as slavery. Transgender individuals are a sign that they're Satan. Terrible things. And they have written blog posts, and they have a history of this extremist agenda. And these are the people that are now being confirmed into our courts. So it's important to be paying attention not just to the Supreme Court, but these over 100 seats that are quickly being filled by this president. And who are those nominees, and how are they going to impact your state, your district, your circuit, and this country? And we have some terrible ones right now. Porter out of Pennsylvania, once before he was blocked because of how bad he was from being nominated. So now he actually has been nominated and is having the Judiciary Committee hearing. And we just really need to be paying attention to these guys too, because again, while we have only like 70 cases that go to the Supreme Court, there are tens of thousands that are heard by the lower courts, and that impacts all the issues we all care about.
Like so much in our world, it starts at the local level, really. I mean, that's one way to look at it. And gosh, folks, you got to get out and vote. I mean, that's another important thing in the next couple of years. You got to get out and vote. Anisha Singh, Senior Organizing Director at Generation Progress, the youth engagement arm of the Center for American Progress, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Anisha, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why the Supreme Court's decision to allow voter purging is so damaging. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The Koch brothers' extremist political agenda of empowering multinational corporations to reign as sovereigns over the majority will of the people has always been inextricably entwined with the profiteering agenda of their wholly owned $100 billion a year industrial conglomerate. The brothers' plutocratic view of business as government even has a name, Pompeo, as in Mike Pompeo, the Trump regime's latest Secretary of State. Years ago, while living in the billionaire brothers' hometown of Wichita, Kansas, Mike got lucky when they pumped a load of Koch capital into a business he had started, turning him into a millionaire. Then they partnered with him in another business that essentially made him a Koch Industries subsidiary. In 2010, they turned this business asset they'd created into a political asset, providing the money from Koch PAC and the backing of their right-wing front group to elect Pompeo to serve as the congressman from Koch. The brothers even installed a Koch Industries lobbyist to run his congressional office. So Mike's been a loyal Koch head, conferring with them and backing bills to advance their corporate and political fortunes. Their investment in Mike became a bonanza last year when he became Trump's yes man as the head of the CIA. And now they've hit the political jackpot, with Pompeo becoming head of the State Department. On everything from international oil deals that profit multinational giants like Koch Industries to supporting the brothers' relentless opposition to all global efforts that would restrict fossil fuel profiteers from causing more climate change. The Koch's personal political insider is now their global corporate asset. This is Jim Hightower saying, to keep up with how Mike converts Koch-headed corporatism into U.S. foreign policy, go to www.prwatch.org/topics/Koch-exposed.
To get more of Jim Hightower's populist take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to, visit www.hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A recent Supreme Court decision gives a green light to the practice of voter purging. Journalist John Nichols says it's another blow to free and fair elections, and one that voters can resist. And we say hello to John Nichols, national affairs correspondent for The Nation and author most recently of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America. John also recently wrote an article in The Nation titled Why the Supreme Court's Voter Purge Ruling is So Damaging. John Nichols, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's an honor to be with you.
Well, and it's ours to have you with us. So remind us what this decision was about.
Sure. This decision came out of an Ohio case. And Ohio has in many senses been kind of ground zero in the struggles over voting rights in America. It's a traditional battleground state that, particularly in the 2010 and 2014 elections, swung very much to the Republicans. The Republicans who took charge of the state have worked very hard to make it more difficult to vote on a variety of fronts. But one of the things that they've done is develop that the Secretary of State in Kansas has done in particular, is develop an elaborate system for purging voters from the voting rolls, from the list, who are not constant voters. And one of the things we need to understand is a lot of Americans don't vote in every election. We wish they did. But there are a lot of Americans who vote in a presidential election when they're excited about it, maybe vote in a local election, but then might miss a couple of elections, even a statewide election or a couple of them. And usually, in an awful lot of states, if you're on the roll and if you haven't moved or anything, you just stay on the roll. So you don't even think about it. You just go and vote when you feel like it. What they were doing in Ohio was sending out a notification in the mail that, frankly, didn't look like any big deal, saying, if you don't get back to us and tell us that, you live where you do and are a regular voter and all this stuff like that, if you don't send us back a notice, we're going to purge you from the rolls. But a lot of people saw it as junk mail. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that this is the case. But there was a tremendous amount of purging of voters from the rolls in Ohio. And so you ended up with a situation where people who had served in the military overseas, people who had had illnesses, people who, just were, again, irregular voters, showed up at the polls and suddenly they're told, oh, we got no record of you. And this became a serious, serious problem. So the A. Philip Randolph Institute, a historic civil rights group, sued. A lot of other civil rights groups came in. A lot of other voting rights groups came in. They fought a case that looked like it was, should have succeeded without a blink of the eye. Unfortunately, they got to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that Ohio, and by extension other states, can continue voter purges. And so this is a very, very serious threat to voting rights, not just in Ohio, but in states across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's, precedents, right? I mean, that's a dangerous one. And now the argument for purging votes is that it prevents voter fraud. Does that argument even hold water?
Not a bit. It's a ridiculous argument. For one thing, it's somebody who wants to commit voter fraud is voting a lot, right? They're trying. Usually, the theory is that they're voting more than they should, not that they miss some elections. So it's on the surface an absurdity, a structural absurdity. But beyond that, look, there are so many ways to guard against voter fraud, to guard against, even mistakes that voters may make. And it's important to understand that voter fraud is exceptionally rare. Mistakes happen, and we understand that. But the way to do that is to be in a positive, affirmative contact with voters, saying, here's where your voting place is, here's, how to keep up to date, you know what I mean? To kind of encourage people in the process, not to try and purge them out of it. And one thing to understand is that in states that do not have same-day registration, i.e., when you come to the polls, if you're not on the list, you can register. In states that don't have same-day registration, this purging process can effectively disenfranchise voters. I mean, literally, you show up, you assumed you were on the list, you're ready to vote in an election for president or governor or mayor or some other position, and you're told, well, you're not on the list. You say, well, okay, well, I'd like to get back on the list. And they say, well, you should have done that a month and a half ago or 2 months ago. You should have registered long ago. What's really happening here is this is making it dramatically harder for the people who we, as Americans, should want to come into the process, right? We should want to bring irregular voters in, encourage them to be regular voters, to get them, out to the polls, not just in presidential elections, but in off-year elections and local elections. And instead, what Ohio's done, and what they will, if they get away with this, continue to do, and what other states could do in even more egregious forms, is going to discourage high turnout elections. And that's bad for democracy in general, but that's especially bad for a democracy that might be representative or more representative of communities that have historically been disenfranchised.
Absolutely. And in your article, you quote Kristen Clark, president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, who calls the Husted decision a monumental setback for those who care about access to democracy in our country. So how does this decision fit into the larger context of voting rights?
Well, look, we're in a really rough moment for voting rights in the United States right now. We had wonderful progress through much of the 20th century, with all the horrors and challenges that you saw, slowly but surely, as a country. During the 20th century, we, through constitutional amendments, quite often gave women the vote, extended clear voting rights to Native Americans, expanded the franchise for Latinos in the Southwest in particular, and then through the historic efforts of the civil rights movement of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, succeeded in getting passage of not just the Voting Rights Act, but also a constitutional amendment to end the poll tax, the wealth barrier to voting. We also saw, the real extension of the franchise, not just a law, but genuine efforts in the South via the Voting Rights Act to open up the process. We lowered the voting age to 18 to 21-year-olds, so people who fight in wars can actually vote on whether to go and fight in those wars. It was a really remarkable period of opening things up. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is backtracking all over the place, where you're seeing restrictive voter ID laws passed, efforts to limit early voting, efforts to just in general make it harder to vote. And I would argue, in agreement with the quote you just read, that purges of voters literally removing people who've gone to the trouble to get on the rolls is one of the ugliest forms of assaulting voting rights that you can imagine. Again, this isn't the direction we should be going. We should be going in the exact opposite direction, what states like Oregon are doing, where they are affirmatively seeking to make sure that people do get onto the rolls. And, as a state government, kind of going out of the way to say, how do we make sure you're registered? How do we make sure it's easy for you to vote? That's what a country that wants all-in representative democracy would be doing.
I mean, that's what it's supposed to be about. I mean, so it is sort of, it's counterintuitive that this is going on, quite frankly. We're speaking to John Nichols, national affairs correspondent for The Nation, author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America, and also a recent article in The Nation, Why the Supreme Court's Voter Purge ruling is so damaging. John, Kristen Clark also says this decision couldn't come at a more important time. What do we know about the possibility that more states will in fact use voter purge programs, and what could be the impact on the upcoming elections?
Well, there's a little bit of impact on the upcoming election, without a doubt. Remember, we're well into this process, and so in some states you are arguably beyond a purging moment, right? But that's not guaranteed. One of the things that we have seen, and I've covered voting rights for a long time, is that you have secretaries of state who are highly motivated to, frankly, make it harder to vote. I don't think there's another way to say it, who do come up with all sorts of last-minute strategies. And I think that in Ohio, if what we're hearing from who's now running for higher office and other folks, that it's unlikely that you'll see a major purge in Ohio. Remember, they've already done a lot there. But other states could either extend what they're already doing, and there are a number of states that have purge programs in place, or even implement a purge program at this point, at this very late date. So it's something you have to monitor very closely. And obviously, there are groups like the National Commission on Voter Justice and the Lawyers Committee, which you recognize, and all sorts of other organizations, even ACLU, that are keeping a close eye on this. But it is a serious concern for 2018. I would argue it should be seen as a front and center concern for 2020, the next presidential election. And one of the reasons I would suggest that is that, when and if Donald Trump is running for re-election, the signals that have come from the Trump administration as regards voting rights have really been, for lack of a better term, radical. The commission that the president attempted to, or did in fact develop, with Chris Kobach, a longtime advocate for restricting voting rights, and Mike Pence at the lead, it fell apart. That effort really was kind of wrecked on its own failures and its own very troublesome approach. But it was clear evidence that this administration, working with its allies in the states, is quite determined to adopt a restrictive view on voting rights. Now, you can, if you want to honor them with some faith that they're sincere and that they really believe wrongly that there's voter fraud, or if you want to suggest that they really are trying to make it hard to vote, whichever way you want to go at that, the vulnerability remains the same and the concern remains the same. And so we have to be incredibly vigilant in 2018. And again, I would say at an even higher level as we head toward 2020.
Well, in your article, you point out that there are ways to fight back, and one person fighting is Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown. He and Amy Klobuchar have introduced the Save Voters Act. What would the bill do, and does it really have a chance of passing?
The bill that they propose is a really smart proposal. And here's the interesting thing. Sherrod Brown is a former Secretary of State. He was the Secretary of State of Ohio back in, I think we have to go back a little ways here, I think the 1980s. But as a very young man, So he really knows that it is possible to develop systems and standards for making it easy to vote. And what their bill does is provide some national standards and some national ideas, and also avenues for supporting them. And this is one of the interesting things about how this all works. States run elections. That's an important thing to understand. It's maybe not something that we should be as comfortable with as we historically have been, because states now have very erratic and irregular standards. But the federal government has a lot of ability to encourage states to do the right thing with resources, with structural support. And, that's one of the things that Sherrod Brown and Amy Klobuchar understand. So they've put together a good bill, an important bill. Unfortunately, the challenge of getting good bills and important bills on voting rights through the current Congress is huge. Remember, this is a Congress which has an opportunity right now to enact a bipartisan proposal to renew the Voting Rights Act, which was undermined by a Supreme Court decision several years ago, and has not taken that opportunity. Pause and think about that. We've got a Voting Rights Act in America, civil rights groups, voting rights groups, Democrats and responsible Republicans say that Voting Rights Act should be renewed and extended, made fully functional in these times. And yet this Congress, under Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, has not even begun to take the legislation up. So I fear to say that the Brown-Klobuchar proposal has many challenges ahead of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also a great deal of pushback at the state level. You write about some of the progressive Democrats in state houses who are fighting for voting rights. What are they doing?
Well, there's a lot of ways to do this. I mean, look, you can do automatic voter registration. You can pass laws in the states that obviously bar purges and encourage real functional voting systems and voting structures. So yes, there's people on the ground in states across the country. There are governors and secretaries of state who are doing a terrific job. Again, I'd point to Oregon, where Kate Brown, a former secretary of state, is now the governor. The work she's done out there to do automatic voter registration, to really develop out a vote by mail system, all sorts of other really innovative reforms ought to be looked at as a model. Other states are following in that trajectory. But unfortunately, it sort of divides along partisan lines. There are states where you don't see innovation. You don't see things heading in the right direction. And here's where it comes down. In most states across the country, we elect the Secretary of State. So we elect the chief election officer, or at least the person who has a serious oversight role as regards elections. This is something that folks ought to be focused on. It's easy to focus on races for the U.S. Senate, races for governor, races for Congress. Unfortunately, those down-ballot races don't always get the attention that they should. And what I want to emphasize to people is electing secretaries of state who are absolutely committed to making voting easy, obviously secure, but also, accessible, and who have as their ultimate goal high turnout elections that underpin and support representative democracy. That's a big deal. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in many places around the country, electing a Secretary of State who is committed to democracy may be one of the most important votes that people cast.
Are there other things that voters can do to make a difference on this issue?
Sure. Voters themselves can ask legislators and members of the House and the Senate, the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, about these issues. They put it on the radar, not just of Democratic representatives, but also Republicans, because it is important to remember there are some Republicans who have been good on voting rights issues. You want to shore them up and encourage them to step up, especially at a time when we have all the controversy as regards attempts to meddle with our elections, be they foreign or domestic. And so talking about these issues is a big deal. Talking about them in a knowing way bringing up the court's decision on voter purges. That's a really vital thing to do. Voting for candidates who have clearly endorsed or encouraged a all-in democracy approach is a big deal. The final thing that voters can do is something that's self-protective, and that is make sure before the election that your name is on the roll. You shouldn't have to jump through so many hoops, but it is worth checking, and it is worth working with groups, again, like the ACLU, like the A. Philip Randolph Institute, like National Commission on Voter Justice, like the Lawyers Committee, many of which have local or down toward the grassroots affiliates, as well as organizations like the NAACP, Common Cause, various voting rights groups in the states. You can find folks who will help you to make sure your name is on the roll and who will help you in this process. Final thing I would suggest, you get to a polling place and somebody tells you that your name isn't on the roll and you know that it has been in the past, at the very least, demand a provisional ballot and do everything you can to make sure it's counted.
Very good. John Nichols, national affairs correspondent for The Nation, author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America. I love that title, by the way. And, of course, we've been talking about the recent article that John wrote in The Nation titled, Why the Supreme Court's Voter Purge Ruling is So Damaging. John, thank you so much for your time with us today on America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
It's a great pleasure. I really appreciate the interest in this issue.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Congressman Dan Kildee. In the wake of Helsinki, he says it's time for the Republicans to step up.
We saw collusion yesterday. We saw it happen right in front of our very eyes with Donald Trump standing alongside of Vladimir Putin. Hello, everybody. On a Tuesday, July 17, 2018, great to see you today, and thank you for joining us as we try to make sense of, you can't make sense of it, but unravel and figure out what the hell happened and where we go from here. Donald Trump back in the White House, but that's not the end of the story. Good to have you with us today, wherever you are in this great land of ours. We are there right alongside of you, online, on YouTube, youtube.com/The Bill Press Show. We're there with you on television, on Free Speech TV, and out in the greater Chicago area. Hello, WCPT listeners. In studio with us, Congressman Dan Kildee from Michigan's 5th Congressional District. We always have a lot to talk about, but boy, today, of all days, Congressman, let's just get your general reaction to this news conference between the president and Vladimir Putin.
It's astounding. I didn't think I could be shocked anymore by this imbecile, but he's done it. And I guess the most flattering
we
thing...
all thought we'd heard the worst from Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday, even for us critics, exceeded the worst.
Yeah, and one of the things that's frustrating to me, and I hear this from some of the folks even back home, who are still trying to say, but Hillary would have been worse. You know what? It's not about Hillary. Forget it. Forget about Hillary Clinton. That is history. You won the election. We see it. We know it. We live it every single day.
And have never doubted it.
Yeah, and you know what? It is what it is.
Yeah.
We take responsibility for that. So I don't, Trump's going to say what he's going to say. But for all of those folks out there who generally think they're benefiting from his policies, I get that. But don't default to making this a question about whether Hillary Clinton would be better or worse. I mean, we all have our opinions on that. But it doesn't matter. It does not matter. We have a president of the United States right now, today, that we have to deal with. The most flattering thing you can say about what he did is that it was imbecilic. The other conclusions are far more nefarious. What in the hell is going on in this country?
John Brennan, former head of the CIA, said it amounts to treason.
Yeah, I think we've heard a lot more. I mean, he betrayed the United States. I mean, I don't know what the literal definition or the legal definition of treason is, but he betrayed the interest of the United States in favor of what this simpleton sees as his own interests. Now, I don't believe it's in his own interest, but he sees his current everything through his own interests. So the question as to whose side he's on, he's not on the side of the United States. He's not on Putin's side. He's not on Melania's side. Mm-hmm. He's not on Don Jr.'s side. Donald Trump gets up every morning, and the only thing he thinks about is what's good for Donald Trump. And of course, not being very bright leads him down a path that may not be so good for him, but his initial and constant instinct is to try to just butter both sides of his own slice of bread.
You say about some people see this still all about Hillary. So does he.
He does, for sure.
I mean,
he does for sure.
Yesterday, he went totally out of whack, right, off topic, everything, to bring it back to, look at me. I won the election. I beat Hillary easily. I ran a brilliant campaign. I got 306 electoral votes. He went on
every
and
time he decides he doesn't quite get the numbers right.
Doesn't quite get the numbers right.
Right.
But again, he had to, and then where are Hillary's emails? Why aren't you out after and why didn't they give up the server in this whole thing?
You know, there's so many aspects of this.
He wants to bring it all back to Hillary, as if, Congressman, he can't accept the fact that he did win.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that's the
2
one.
2 years later, he's still trying to convince people, I won. We know that.
He's in constant search of some sort of validation.
Yeah.
And it's not going to happen. It's never going to come. The only way to validate yourself is to function in a way that's valid, and he's not doing that.
But in a sense, he already has his validation. He's got Air Force One. He's got the White House. He's got the job, right? But he doesn't get it.
Stuff is not enough for him. There's so many aspects of this that are painful. A couple that come to mind beyond the obvious. One, we need a Republican Party in this country, and we don't have one right now.
Amen.
We need them to step up and not just express their disappointment.
Right.
Disappointment is when, you spill your coffee. Disappointment?
Yeah.
It should be outrage. It should be unfettered outrage at a president who has placed American interest behind his own, and in doing so has actually placed Vladimir Putin ahead of everyone else that he interacts with, because clearly his interests lie in keeping a cozy relationship with this despot. But the other part of it is that is so offensive is this is the same president who criticizes NFL players for using their First Amendment right to express themselves by taking a knee at a football game, for God's sake. At a football game. Yeah. Something as trivial as a game of sport played on television. And he expresses all this moral outrage, and then he himself kneels before Vladimir Putin. What a jackass.
Yeah.
Can I say that on the radio?
You can. You just said it.
Okay.
You just did.
Okay.
And we love it.
All right.
But yeah, and it gets to what I kept thinking all during the news conference yesterday was, this is Charlottesville all over again.
I think it's Charlottesville
worse
in some ways. I mean, but it's hard to...
This moral equivalency of, Peter, that one clip where he said, I blame both sides, both countries are responsible, right?
I hold both countries responsible. I think that the United States has been foolish. I think we've all been foolish. We should have had this dialogue a long time ago, a long time, frankly, before I got to office.
And yeah, I mean, in a sense, we all say we ought to have better relations with Russia, but you can't ignore what Russia has done.
Yeah.
And he says that the Mueller investigation, that's why we have bad relations with Russia, because Mueller's conducting this investigation. Nothing, Congressman, nothing about annexing Crimea, invading Ukraine, shooting down a Malaysian airliner, poisoning agents on UK soil, assassinating political enemies, infiltrating this 2016. No, they didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
We did everything wrong.
Right. And in the same breath, many Americans will be rightfully critical of Bashar al-Assad and all that he does. How does he get away with that? Because Vladimir Putin supports him.
Yeah.
I mean, so the problem with the
president, maybe even assisted in his use of chemical weapons. We don't know for sure, but he certainly supports him.
Sure.
Even though he's using chemical weapons.
I mean, it's so hard to not default into amateur psychoanalysis here, but it does seem as though this equivalency that the president always searches for is rooted in the fact that he has no understanding of morality himself. I mean, in order to apply some judgment, you actually have to have a source of morality to apply to the situation. He doesn't have that. Everything for him, it seems, is purely transactional. Purely transactional. There's two sides. Both sides. This equivalency is based in the fact that he doesn't seem to have a moral compass of his own.
But you're right. I mean, in Charlottesville, there are some good people on both sides, right? Yeah, there's some good people among those white supremacists and those neo-Nazis. But, in Helsinki, there goes some good people on both sides, but I take this side.
Yeah. No, that's exactly true.
But I take this side, which is against us.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the difference between what he did and somebody who burns the American flag?
Somebody who burns the American flag, while we might find it objectionable, does not side against the American people. They find the most significant way they can to express their outrage
about American government policy or something. A war.
I might not. It's certainly not something I encourage. I wouldn't do it myself. This is a guy who has actually taken sides with essentially our enemy. They attacked us. In the 21st century, the form of attack, is a little different than it was in the 19th and 20th centuries. They attacked us, and they continue to attack our democracy. And Trump's good with it.
So what, we heard Jeff Flake, Newt Gingrich, the whole list come out, Marco Rubio, even Mitch McConnell, even Paul Ryan say some critical things. What do you expect them to do, number one, and what could they do? What would you like to see? What action would you like to see?
Well, and I would. It's hard to say specific to
realistically
specific to this situation. I would like to see even stronger rebuke.
Mm-hmm.
But I this is a slightly different tack. What I would really like to see in response to this is that they get up in the morning every day and go do their jobs and stop giving Donald Trump more authority than the Constitution grants him. Because right now, for the year and a half that he's been president, Paul Ryan has made Donald Trump the Speaker of the House, and Mitch McConnell has made Donald Trump the leader of the Senate. They should just do their jobs and send the president legislation. Yeah. And if he wants to sign it, put your big old signature on it. And if you don't, you know what? Fine.
Yeah.
But they
will not bring an item up for vote unless they know Donald Trump gives them the green light. And you're right. They let him decide what Congress votes on.
He has a pre-veto on everything. He is the leader of the House and the Senate and the White House. And, of course, now, absent some miracle, he will have his majority on the Supreme Court. This is I'm not one that is prone to hyperbole. This is a pretty frightening moment for us right now, because it's not clear to me that Republicans in the House and Senate, absent this congressional election, forget about that for a minute, that they will understand this moment in history and act accordingly and take back the rightful authority that they have in the Constitution and just do their jobs. I would feel so much more comfortable with this imbecile in the White House if I felt like the natural checks and balances that were written into this elegant document, the U.S. Constitution, were being exercised. They're not.
Could Congress pass a resolution condemning what the president said yesterday?
For sure. And I think that would be an appropriate step for us to take, a strong condemnation of the president's words and behavior, I think are completely in order.
And maybe a resolution affirming what the Justice Department and the Director of National Intelligence have stated in terms of the reality of Russia's interference in the 2016 election.
Clearly,
I mean, that indictment of the 12 military officers last Friday was so detailed, so specific, so evidential. I mean, it was all there. There was no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And Congress could say, we accept this. We believe it. It happened.
Right. And, credit where credit's due. Kudos to Chris Wallace at Fox News, who, that's not a source that I depend upon. But credit where credit's due. He handed Vladimir Putin the indictments.
Yeah.
He had more steel in his spine than the person who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. A low bar, admittedly,
right.
But at least it was put in front of him.
Yeah, and Putin wouldn't even look at them. Could Congress also ask for by resolution, I guess, to ask for the extradition of those 12
We clearly should. And, of course, everyone says, well, we know that they won't do it. Okay.
Yeah,
okay. I don't,
Yeah.
Fine. But that doesn't mean that we just walk away and say, because you say so, you get to win every fight. We have to stand up and fight for our country once in a while. There's a lot of people who have done this and given up a much greater sacrifice than Donald Trump could ever imagine.
Right.
So let's just honor them by standing up for our country and demanding some form of justice. Again, these people should be brought to justice. Now, of course, Putin will protect them.
Yeah.
They were acting at his direction. He ultimately is the person who's responsible for all this. Anyone who believes that this former KGB agent, who has a firm and unwavering control over every mechanism of the Russian government, did not direct and oversee this attack on our democracy, whoever takes that position is ignorant. With
these 12 military officers, it's also, I thought it was very revealing yesterday that Putin did affirm, of course I wanted Donald Trump to win.
Yeah. It's interesting. There were two questions posed to him that he answered in that moment in the affirmative. He wanted him to win, and did he direct any of his officers and officials to pursue that? And he said, yes, I did. Yes, I did. Now, one could argue that maybe he was only answering the first question. But I thought that was interesting.
The other one was interesting, which I don't think anyone has been asked before, is, do you have any compromising material?
He didn't say no.
Trump? He didn't say no. No. We played this earlier, but it's worth playing again because he made the argument, he made the point, which Donald Trump himself has contradicted, that when Trump was in Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant, Putin didn't know who he was and didn't even know he was there. Now, if you go back to Donald Trump's interviews at the time,
oh yeah,
he said, I talk to Putin all the time.
I know Putin.
Yeah, I know Putin's one of my. We have a very special relationship. The whole thing. Now, one of them is lying,
or both,
Yes,
more likely.
And he says, well, for example, everybody comes over. We couldn't do this. There were 500 people at this one meeting recently in St. Petersburg.
There were over 500 American businessmen, the high-ranking, the high-level ones. I don't even remember the last names of each and every one of them. Well, do you think that we try to collect compromising material on each and every single one of them? Well, it's difficult to imagine.
Not on each and every one. Not on each and every one.
No,
it's just on some.
It's difficult to imagine. Not impossible.
I don't think it's difficult to imagine at all.
Sure.
Knowing the KGB, yeah. I mean,
It almost sounds like he's going to, I mean, obviously this is through a translator, but through his words, it's just kind of like, I dare you. I dare you.
Quick little tangent, I know, but personal anecdote. Under the Soviet Union, last year of the Soviet Union, Carol and I with our kids were in Ukraine and in Russia, in Moscow, on a peace mission. And we decided we were going to go off to St. Petersburg to visit some refuseniks.
Mm-hmm.
We went off on our own.
Wow.
We made our own. We left the group. We didn't tell anybody. We didn't get permission to it. We bought airline tickets, and we went off on our own, left the group, went to the airport, flew to St. Petersburg, and we got off the plane in St. Petersburg, and there was a member of the Russian government waiting to greet us with a car and a driver and took us to our hotel. Mr. and Mrs. Press, welcome to St. Petersburg. Now, you can't tell me that they don't.
Yeah.
They know everything about everybody who goes there. Yeah.
When Press or Trump show up, they pay attention.
Do they have any compromising material on you, Mr. Press?
No comment. And now for the news.
It's difficult to imagine.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you were overdrawn on that one account. That's probably about it.
Right.
No, but this showed, I just thought, oh, my God, this place, they really...
for sure. And no, there's no... That has not changed.
Microphones and cameras in every hotel room.
Yeah. Probably microphones in the meeting room in Helsinki where the two met privately.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, too. So they met for over 2 hours.
Right.
Just the two of them and their translators.
And so
we still have no freaking idea what they talked about. Putin does.
Yeah, for sure.
He probably had a little device on him.
Yeah. And what Trump did in the news conference was gave what he thought was the sanitized version of that conversation. Can you imagine the more acceptable?
Right.
Can you imagine what he may have said in the one-on-one meeting where he did not trust Bolton to be in the room?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't trust Pompeo to be in the room. He didn't trust Huntsman,
John Kelly,
to be in the room.
Right.
Kelly, any of them to be in the room. Didn't want to have them hear what he needed to say to Vladimir Putin.
And I don't know that there was an opportunity afterwards where Trump sat down with that team and unpacked and said, okay, this came up and I said this and I agreed to this, and this came up and I agreed to that. I mean, you would think that would have to happen.
I thought it was remarkable that Dan Coates issued his own statement without White House approval. I don't know if this will happen, but to maintain any kind of honor and reputation, he should probably resign.
If he had any honor, he would resign, I believe.
Yeah.
So what about this one thing we do know that they talked about? In fact, Donald Trump said it was the best idea since sliced bread, which was, Vladimir Putin offered to send his spies over here to work inside the FBI and the CIA and the NSA, and we'll share all of our secrets, and they can help us unravel this whole thing. What a wonderful idea. We'll take you up on that idea.
This is how the Russian term, I don't know the translation, but this is where the concept of useful idiot was born. The idea that he would entertain such an idea speaks to the man's... I mean, everyone says he's a smart guy. I'm not sold on that. And no smart person would not understand exactly what Vladimir Putin was doing there.
It's almost like
it's beyond comprehension.
We don't have to spy on you. We'll come here openly, and you will open your doors, and we'll just infiltrate without even having to lift a finger, right? Yeah. Because, pardon me, you're going to give us the keys to Fort Knox.
Right.
The idea that Trump would not immediately see, nice try, Vlad.
One thing, is a bit of a tangent, that goes unchallenged far too often is this assertion by Republicans and the president himself that there's no collusion.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we don't know whether or not there's collusion. That's the whole purpose of this investigation.
Oh, no. Right.
I would be happy to learn that there was no collusion, by the way. I don't think it's a good thing, but we don't know that.
We do not. I think we've seen, by the way, plenty of examples of it, but we do not have that fact. We have not seen the evidence yet from Robert Mueller.
Right.
He's not concluded his investigation.
Well,
so the most they can say is Mueller hasn't given any evidence of it or charged anyone with it yet.
Well, there's this arrest that took place yesterday, I think, could be revealing on that particular question.
I think the whole news conference was collusion yesterday.
Yeah, it was, for sure. But the fact that simultaneous with that was this arrest of this young woman who's close ties to the NRA was, if one reads that, it's clear that there are American persons or U.S. persons with whom she was interacting. Now, whether or not that constitutes collusion is another question.
But that was over and above the Mueller investigation.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So, Congressman, we've been here before. We've been here many times. We have talked before about the question of impeachment.
Right.
And I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that you have said, you certainly think there are impeachable offenses, but now's not the time maybe to move forward. Do you still believe that today, after yesterday?
I'm rethinking that, to be honest with you. I've been struggling with this all night long because I take that question very seriously.
I know you do.
And I can't say that I have the same position that I had even yesterday. This is really troubling.
If there were not a case for impeachment before, I could see why a lot of people, and again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, could say, well, I wasn't sure before, but now I am. There is a case.
I'm no longer of the view that it's something that should be off the table. I hate coming to that conclusion, but this president represents a danger to the interests of the United States. He really does.
Have you gone so far as to say there is a case now to impeach him now?
We had some discussion even on that yesterday, and I think there'll be more in the next few days. I can't say that that's the conclusion that I'll draw, but I will say this, that the president has acted in a manner that has encouraged those conversations.
But you're definitely rethinking it.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Thanks for coming in this morning.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, always good to see you. Joe Cirincione from the Plowshares Fund, our own foreign policy guru. Well, we share him with the Plowshares Fund, and we share him with a lot of other networks, too, and some good friends in Congress who depend on his assistance as well. It's a quick break. We'll be back with Joe Cirincione, and thanks to Congressman Dan Kildee.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Anisha Singh, John Nichols, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.